The television studio lights blazed like the fires of judgment itself, casting harsh shadows across the burgundy leather chairs of Faith and Politics, America's most watched Sunday morning battleground. The air crackled with tension that could be felt through the screens of 12 million Americans clutching their coffee cups, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented. This wasn't just another political discussion, this was about to become the most devastating takedown in religious television history. Joyce Meyer sat like an empress on her throne, her perfectly styled hair catching the studio lights, her $4,000 designer suit impeccable, her confidence radiating the kind of authority that comes from decades of commanding audiences and amassing a personal fortune worth $25 million. She leaned forward slightly, her manicured fingers adorned with rings that could pay a teacher's salary, her smile the practiced expression of someone who'd built an empire by telling desperate people exactly what they wanted to hear about God, money, and miracles. Across from her, Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana sat quietly in his off-the-rack gray suit, looking for all the world like he'd wandered in from a small-town courthouse rather than the marble halls of Washington. His weathered hands rested on a battered leather briefcase that seemed almost apologetic in this gleaming television cathedral. The crew had probably assumed he was someone's aide when he first walked in. Click the subscribe button because in a moment you'll see how a simple country lawyer destroyed an empire built on nothing but lies and how the internet exploded. The show's host, Sandra Williams, a veteran journalist whose sharp intelligence had earned her 3 Emmys and the grudging respect of Washington's power players, glanced at her notes and felt her pulse quicken. She knew Meyer had specifically requested Kennedy as a guest, ostensibly to discuss faith and fiscal responsibility. But whispers from production staff suggested Meyer had a more personal agenda, publicly crushing a senator who'd been quietly investigating tax irregularities in religious organizations. "Good morning, and welcome to Faith and Politics," Sandra began, her voice carrying practiced authority. "Today we're examining the intersection of faith and finance with Prosperity Minister Joyce Meyer and Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana." Meyer's smile broadened, her eyes gleaming with the confidence of a predator who'd spotted what appeared to be easy prey. She'd done her research on Kennedy, or so she thought. Small-town lawyer, folksy manner, probably intimidated by her theological credentials and media empire. This would be easier than collecting offerings from desperate believers. "Senator Kennedy," Meyer began, her voice dripping with false warmth that had made her millions. "I appreciate you joining us, though I have to wonder if perhaps your time might be better spent on issues you actually understand, rather than questioning legitimate religious organizations that bring hope and prosperity to millions." The first shot had been fired, but it would be Meyer's last clean hit. Kennedy's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the studio's atmosphere like electricity before a storm. Sandra Williams felt it immediately, the charge that precedes either greatness or complete disaster. Camera operators sensed it too, their lenses instinctively adjusting for what they somehow knew was coming. "Well, ma'am," Kennedy replied, his Louisiana drawl soft as Spanish moss, "I appreciate your concern for my schedule. My constituents back home seem satisfied with how I prioritize my time, but I'm always interested in hearing from folks who've built such remarkable financial empires through their ministry work." The word financial hung in the air with just enough emphasis to make Meyer's eye twitch. This wasn't the defensive response she'd expected. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her features before the practiced smile reasserted itself. "Senator, I've dedicated my life to helping people achieve the prosperity that God intends for them," Meyer continued, her tone sharpening like a blade. "My ministry has transformed millions of lives, brought hope to the hopeless, and demonstrated God's desire for His people to live abundantly. Perhaps instead of questioning organizations that actually help people, you should focus on addressing the real economic challenges facing your own state." It was surgical in its precision. Meyer had just accused Kennedy of neglecting Louisiana while attacking successful ministries that were actually helping people. The implication was clear. He was a small-minded politician, picking on religious organizations because he couldn't handle real problems. But Kennedy had been preparing for this conversation longer than Meyer could imagine. Comment below if you've ever felt like someone was using their success to dismiss your legitimate concerns. The senator reached down and placed his weathered hand on his briefcase with the deliberate precision of a surgeon selecting the right instrument. The gesture was subtle, but Meyer's trained eye caught it like a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. "Mrs. Meyer," Kennedy said, his voice maintaining that deceptive gentleness that had lulled countless witnesses into overconfidence. "You're absolutely right that prosperity ministries help people. That's precisely why I take such a keen interest in understanding exactly how they operate and where all that money goes." Meyer stiffened almost imperceptibly. This conversation was veering into dangerous territory. "Senator," she shot back, her media training fully engaged. Are you questioning the transparency of legitimate religious organizations? Because that sounds dangerously close to the kind of government overreach that should concern any true defender of religious freedom. It was masterful, turning Kennedy's inquiry into an attack on the First Amendment itself. Meyer had used this deflection countless times when critics questioned her ministry's finances, wrapping herself in constitutional protection whenever uncomfortable questions arose. But Kennedy's briefcase was already clicking open. "Ma'am, I'm a great believer in religious freedom," he replied, his tone still conversational. "I'm also a great believer in transparency, especially when tax-exempt organizations accumulate massive wealth while claiming to help the poor." He pulled out a manila folder marked with official seals. "For instance, I've been reading your ministry's most recent IRS Form 990. Fascinating document, really." The blood drained from Meyer's face so quickly that the studio makeup artist later swore she could see it happen in real time. "Senator, I don't think a public forum is appropriate for," Meyer began, but Kennedy was already opening the folder. "Oh, but these are public records, ma'am, available to anyone who asks." He adjusted his reading glasses with theatrical precision. Joyce Meyer Ministries reported total revenues of $98.5 million last year, nearly $100 million. That's more than the GDP of some small countries. The number hit the studio like a physical force. Sandra Williams found herself doing mental calculations. $98.5 million could fund a lot of actual charity work, but Kennedy was just getting started with his mathematics lesson. "Now what I find particularly educational," he continued, flipping through pages with the methodical precision of an accountant, "is the breakdown of expenses. Program services, that's the actual charitable work helping people, totaled $23.7 million. Administrative costs came to $31.2 million. He looked up at Meyer, his blue eyes sharp as winter frost. "But here's the really interesting number, $43.6 million listed under other expenses. That's nearly half your total revenue, Mrs. Meyer. Care to explain what other expenses might include?" Meyer's media training had completely abandoned her. "Those are legitimate organizational costs." "I'm sure they are," Kennedy agreed pleasantly. "Let me help clarify some specifics." He produced another document. "This property record shows your ministry purchased a $15.8 million mansion in St. Louis, for ministry purposes, of course." The camera caught Meyer's hands gripping her chair arms so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "And this documentation shows the acquisition of a $6.2 million private jet, also for ministry work, I assume." Kennedy's tone remained conversational, but his eyes had turned predatory. "Must be crucial for spreading the gospel in luxury." Sandra Williams found her journalistic instincts kicking in. "Mrs. Meyer, would you like to respond to these specific financial details?" "They're not allegations," Kennedy interjected gently. "They're documented expenditures from public tax filings. The question isn't whether these purchases occurred. They're recorded fact. The question is whether a $15.8 million mansion and a $6.2 million jet represent the kind of charitable work that merits tax exemption. Hold on to your seats, because what Kennedy revealed next exposed the human cost of Meyer's prosperity empire. Meyer finally found her voice, though it trembled with barely controlled rage. "Senator Kennedy, my ministry has helped millions of people discover financial prosperity through faith. The success of our organization reflects God's blessing on our work." Kennedy nodded thoughtfully, then reached into his briefcase again. This time he produced what appeared to be a collection of letters, their edges worn from handling. "That's an interesting theological position, Mrs. Meyer. These are communications from your own supporters, people who followed your teachings about seed offerings and financial breakthroughs. Would you like me to share what some of them wrote?" Meyer's lawyer, sitting just off camera, began making frantic throat-cutting gestures, but Kennedy had already selected his first letter. "This is from Martha Henderson in Kansas City," Kennedy said, his voice taking on the reverent tone usually reserved for reading scripture. "Dear Mrs. Meyer, I sent my last $847 as a seed offering like you promised would return tenfold. That was 8 months ago. My electricity was cut off yesterday, and I don't know how I'll feed my grandchildren. I keep waiting for God's blessing, but all I have are your books telling me to have more faith." The studio fell absolutely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause in respect for Martha Henderson's desperation. But Kennedy wasn't finished bearing witness. "Here's another, from Robert Martinez in Phoenix. I gave my disability check to your ministry every month for 3 years, believing God would heal my diabetes if I showed enough faith. I'm writing this from the hospital because I couldn't afford insulin. The doctors say I might lose my leg. I guess I didn't believe hard enough. Sandra Williams found tears streaming down her face. This wasn't just financial fraud, it was spiritual abuse weaponizing people's faith against their own survival. Meyer's voice was barely above a whisper. Those people, they misunderstood the message. Faith requires proper understanding, and money, Kennedy finished. Always money, channeled specifically through Joyce Meyer Ministries. His voice hardened slightly. Strange how the God you preach seems to require constant financial contributions processed through your organization. He set down the letters with ceremonial care. Mrs. Meyer, in the past 5 years, your ministry has collected over $425 million in donations. Your personal net worth is estimated at $25 million. You own multiple luxury homes, expensive cars, and private aircraft. Meanwhile, people like Martha and Robert are choosing between medication and donations to fund your lifestyle. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the barely audible hum of television equipment. Now I want to ask you a simple question, Kennedy continued, his voice soft but carrying the weight of divine judgment. Do you believe Jesus Christ, who owned nothing, who told the rich young ruler to sell everything and give to the poor, who said it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven, would approve of your $25 million net worth built on the donations of disabled people and desperate grandmothers? The question hung in the studio air like an indictment from heaven itself. Meyer opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words emerged. Sandra Williams leaned forward. Mrs. Meyer. For 10 seconds, an eternity in television time, Meyer sat in complete silence, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Then she did something no one had anticipated. She stood up, removed her microphone, and without a word, walked off the set. The camera followed her exit, capturing every step of what would become the most infamous walkout in religious television history. The studio door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo like a gavel striking the bench of final judgment. Kennedy sat quietly for a moment, then looked directly into the camera, his Louisiana